For some people, being loved feels comforting. For someone whose identity is built heavily around independence, being deeply needed can create a completely different question. Who am I if someone depends on me this much? That question can be difficult to recognize because on the surface, it may look like pressure. It may look like irritation, distance, a sudden need for space, or a strange change in the way they respond to your emotions. But underneath all of that can be something much more personal, a threat to identity. Because there is a difference between someone wanting you and someone beginning to emotionally rely on you. When someone wants you, you can still feel separate. You can still be yourself. You can still leave the room emotionally and return when you are ready. But when someone begins to need you, the relationship can start to feel like a responsibility. And for a person who has built their entire emotional identity around autonomy, responsibility can feel dangerously close to dependence. Not necessarily dependence on you, dependence itself. The idea that another person's emotional stability might somehow become connected to your presence, that their disappointment might become your problem, their sadness might become your responsibility, their reassurance might become something you are expected to provide. And suddenly, love is no longer experienced only as connection. It is experienced as obligation. This is where something subtle begins to happen. They may start asking themselves questions they never consciously intended to ask. What happens if they need more from me tomorrow? What happens if I cannot give it? What happens if they become used to me being here? What happens if leaving becomes impossible without hurting them? And perhaps the deepest question of all, what happens to me? Because sometimes the fear isn't simply, I don't want to be responsible for you. It is, I don't want to lose myself inside what you need from me. And that distinction changes everything. Independence can become more than a preference. It can become an identity. A person may begin to understand themselves through what they do not need. They do not need constant reassurance. They do not need someone checking on them. They do not need emotional caretaking. They do not need to explain every feeling. They can handle things alone. They solve their own problems. They regulate themselves. They keep moving. Over time, these behaviors can stop feeling like behaviors. They start feeling like evidence of who the person is. I am independent. I am capable. I don't depend on people. I handle my own life. That identity can feel extremely safe because identity creates predictability. You know who you are. You know what is expected from you, and you know what is not expected from you. Then a relationship becomes emotionally significant. At first, this can feel good. They enjoy being wanted. They enjoy being appreciated. They may even enjoy being the person someone trusts. There is nothing inherently threatening about that. The problem begins when being important slowly becomes being necessary. Those are not the same thing. Being important says, you matter to me. Being necessary can sound more like, I need you in order to feel okay. And psychologically, those messages can land very differently. The first creates connection. The second can create perceived responsibility. And responsibility can collide directly with an identity built around autonomy. Imagine someone who has spent years believing, I am safest when I can take care of myself. Then someone enters their life and says, emotionally, I feel safest when I can rely on you. Those two systems are not automatically compatible. One is organized around self-containment. The other is organized around emotional reliance. Neither person necessarily means harm, but their nervous systems may interpret closeness differently. One person experiences dependence as intimacy. The other may experience it as increasing obligation. And this is where the relationship can become confusing, because the person who needs more may not realize that their emotional reliance is changing how the other person experiences themselves. They may think, if they love me, why wouldn't they want me to need them? That is a completely understandable question. But attachment isn't always governed by what makes logical sense. Someone can genuinely care about you, while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with how central they have become to your emotional world. That discomfort can create internal conflict, because part of them enjoys being significant. Another part wants their freedom back. And when those two parts collide, the person may begin creating distance, not because they suddenly stopped caring, but because the relationship has started asking them to inhabit an identity they are not comfortable with. The identity of the emotionally responsible person, the person who has to show up, the person who cannot simply disappear for a day without consequences, the person whose choices affect somebody else, the person whose silence means something, the person whose emotional availability has become important. That can feel very different from simply being loved. And sometimes, the person doesn't even recognize that this is what is happening. They simply notice that they are becoming irritated. They want more time alone. Messages that once felt sweet begin feeling demanding. Questions that once felt caring begin feeling intrusive. Someone saying, "Are you okay?" can suddenly feel like, "Explain yourself." Someone saying, "I need you," can be heard internally as, "You're responsible for me." That interpretation may not be objectively accurate, but the emotional system doesn't always respond to objective accuracy. It responds to perceived threat. And when autonomy feels threatened, distance can become a form of psychological protection, not necessarily rejection. Protection. This is where identity fusion becomes important. Identity fusion happens when the boundaries between two people's emotional worlds begin to feel less distinct. You are no longer simply aware of their feelings. You begin feeling responsible for them. Their mood changes your mood. Their disappointment becomes something you feel compelled to fix. Their anxiety becomes something you feel obligated to calm. Their happiness begins to feel connected to your performance in the relationship. For some people, that level of emotional interconnectedness feels deeply intimate. For others, it can feel like the disappearance of psychological space. And psychological space matters, especially for someone whose sense of safety depends heavily on autonomy. They may need to know, "I can love you without becoming responsible for every emotion you experience." That boundary is healthy, but someone with strong avoidant tendencies may struggle to communicate it clearly. Instead of saying, "I care about you, but I need emotional boundaries," they may simply become less available, shorter responses, more solitude, less emotional disclosure, less spontaneous affection, more time spent inside their own world. And from the other person's perspective, it can feel like punishment. You may think, "What did I do? Why did they change? Why does needing them suddenly seem to bother them?" But internally, the avoidant may be experiencing something closer to, "I don't know how to remain myself in this." That is a very different psychological problem, because the conflict isn't always between love and no love. Sometimes it is between connection and identity. They may want closeness, but not at the perceived cost of autonomy. They may want to matter, but not to become indispensable. They may want to be loved, but not to feel emotionally owned. And this creates an uncomfortable paradox. The more secure the other person becomes in relying on them, the more responsible they may feel. And the more responsible they feel, the more they may need distance. Then the distance creates insecurity. The other person reaches for reassurance. The avoidant experiences even more emotional demand. They retreat further. The other person reaches harder, and suddenly, both people are reacting to completely different fears. One is afraid of losing connection. The other is afraid of losing autonomy. Neither necessarily understands the other's internal experience. This is why simply telling someone, just reassure them, can miss the deeper issue. Because reassurance may temporarily calm the relationship without addressing the identity conflict underneath it. If the person believes, my partner needs me to regulate their emotional world, then more reassurance can sometimes reinforce the very role they fear. They don't necessarily need to be convinced that the other person loves them. They may need to experience something much more subtle. That closeness does not erase individuality. That being loved does not mean becoming responsible for another adult's entire emotional life. That commitment does not require psychological disappearance. That two people can be deeply connected and still remain two separate people. That distinction can be transformative because healthy intimacy isn't, I need you to be okay, and it isn't, I don't need you at all. It is closer to, I choose you, without losing myself. That is a very different model of love. And for someone who has spent years equating independence with safety, learning that distinction may take time. Because if independence has always meant, I am safe because nobody needs too much from me, then intimacy requires a new belief. I can be close without becoming consumed. That belief is harder to build, but it is possible, and it changes the entire emotional architecture of a relationship. There is another layer people often miss. Sometimes being needed feels good at first. It can even be intoxicating, because being needed provides evidence of importance. You feel valuable. You feel chosen. You feel significant. For someone who has difficulty receiving intimacy directly, being useful can become a safer way to experience love. If you need me, I know I matter. If I can solve something for you, I know I have a place here. If you depend on me, I don't have to wonder whether I'm important. But eventually, the same thing that made the relationship feel meaningful can become overwhelming. Because being needed creates expectations, and expectations create vulnerability. Now they can disappoint you. Now you can disappoint them. Now their emotional world can be affected by your choices. Now leaving isn't emotionally neutral. And this is where the identity problem becomes more intense. The person may begin to feel trapped inside the role they created. The reliable one, the strong one, the calm one, the one who doesn't need anything, the one who can handle everything. But eventually, the relationship asks, what about you? What do you need? What are you afraid of? Can you depend on me too? Can you let me help you? And that can be surprisingly difficult because accepting care requires dependence, not total dependence, but some degree of openness. And openness can challenge an identity built around self-sufficiency. This is why someone can become uncomfortable not only when you need them, but when you invite them to need you too. You may say, you don't always have to be strong with me. And instead of feeling relieved, they feel exposed. Because now the relationship isn't simply asking them to provide, it is asking them to participate, to be known, to have needs, to admit limitations, to allow another person to matter. That can destabilize an identity built around emotional independence. And sometimes, the person responds by retreating back into competence. They become busy, productive, focused, self-contained. They return to the parts of themselves that feel predictable because competence feels safer than vulnerability. Solving a problem feels safer than admitting fear. Giving advice feels safer than receiving comfort. Being needed can feel safer than needing, until the relationship becomes one-sided without either person intentionally choosing that. One person keeps reaching emotionally, the other keeps functioning emotionally, and both begin wondering why they cannot meet in the middle. But the middle requires something neither person can force, a sense that dependence does not equal disappearance, that receiving does not equal weakness, that giving does not equal ownership, and that love does not require one person to become the emotional infrastructure for another. This matters because there is a healthy version of being needed. Being needed isn't inherently unhealthy. Human beings need one another. Healthy relationships contain dependence. The difference is whether dependence leaves room for individuality. A partner can say, I need your support, without meaning, you are responsible for my emotional stability. A partner can say, I miss you, without meaning, you must abandon your boundaries. A partner can say, I want you here, without meaning, you are no longer allowed to have a life outside of me. Those distinctions matter enormously because the goal isn't to become impossible to need. The goal is to become capable of closeness without turning closeness into possession. And that applies to both people. The person who needs more may need to develop stronger emotional self regulation. The person who fears dependence may need to learn that emotional reliance isn't automatically entrapment. Both people have something to learn, because intimacy is not the elimination of boundaries. It is learning how to remain connected while boundaries still exist. Eventually, the deeper question becomes less about the relationship and more about identity. Who are you when someone loves you deeply? Who are you when someone depends on you? Who are you when you cannot solve everything? Who are you when another person sees your weaknesses? And perhaps most importantly, who are you when you realize that independence and intimacy do not have to be enemies? That is the psychological shift many people never make. They assume there are only two choices: depend on nobody or become responsible for somebody. But there is a third possibility: interdependence. Two people can influence each other without controlling each other. They can support each other without becoming each other's entire support system. They can need each other without losing their separate identities. And they can love deeply without turning love into a job description. For someone with strong avoidant patterns, this can be an especially important distinction because the fear may not be, I don't want love. It may be, I don't know how to remain myself while being loved this deeply. And once you understand that, some behaviors begin to make more psychological sense. The sudden need for space, the discomfort when emotions become intense, the irritation when someone repeatedly seeks reassurance, the urge to become busy, the feeling that the relationship is consuming too much mental space, the desire to reclaim routines, the instinct to emphasize independence. These behaviors don't automatically mean avoidant attachment, and they don't excuse emotional neglect. But when they are part of a broader pattern, they can reveal an internal struggle between connection and autonomy. The answer isn't to chase harder, and it isn't to disappear completely just to make someone realize your value. It is to understand what is actually happening. Because if someone believes your emotional needs have made them responsible for your entire emotional world, the healthiest response isn't to prove that you don't need them. It is to create a relationship where both people can breathe, where you can say, I love you, and also, I can take care of myself, where they can say, I need you, and also, you don't have to carry everything for me. That is where intimacy becomes less threatening, because nobody is being asked to surrender their identity. Nobody has to become the caretaker. Nobody has to become completely self-sufficient either. There is room for two people, two nervous systems, two identities, two lives, connected, but not consumed. And maybe that is the real lesson behind being needed. The healthiest relationship isn't one where nobody needs anyone. And it isn't one where one person carries the emotional weight of two people. It is one where needing each other does not require either person to disappear. Because love should expand your sense of self, not replace it. So if you've ever been on the receiving end of someone who seemed uncomfortable with how much you needed them, don't immediately assume that their discomfort meant you were too much. And don't automatically assume that it meant they didn't care. Sometimes the deeper conflict was happening inside their definition of themselves. They may have spent years believing, I am okay because I don't need anyone. And suddenly, you gave them a relationship where being needed became unavoidable. That can be beautiful and frightening at the same time. But remember this, you are not responsible for becoming smaller so someone else can tolerate intimacy. And they are not responsible for carrying your entire emotional world. Healthy love asks both people to grow, not by becoming less themselves, but by discovering that closeness doesn't have to erase individuality. If this gave you a different way to understand avoidant attachment, don't just listen to the part that describes them. Listen for the part that describes the relationship itself. Because sometimes the most important question isn't, why did they pull away? It is, what did closeness begin to mean to both of us? Sometimes the person who struggles most with being needed isn't running from love. They're trying to protect an identity that was built around never needing anyone and never being needed too much. If this gave you a different way to understand avoidant behavior, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey and tell me in the comments, when does being needed stop feeling like connection and start feeling like responsibility?